Chapter 6. The Role of Intuition. Having understood the structure and anatomy of the levels of human awareness, we will now return to our examination of the mind, intuition, and the details of the fourth level of consciousness, the level of awareness, from where the intuitive process in human awareness arises. From this fourth level of human awareness, intuition flows, and we are able to transcend the limitations of time, space, and causation. We are able to pick up knowledge in experience without any use of the mental processes, without sensing, reasoning, or creative thinking. All knowing at this level of awareness takes place through the faculty in human consciousness, which is called the human soul. The entire quantity of awareness possessed by man is contained and distributed by the soul to the lower dimensions of consciousness. It is the original source in you of all life, of all your movements and activities. The human soul is the force which impels you to be alive, the force which sustains your being. It is the source of all human awareness, and yet there are millions of people who do not believe in the existence of the human soul. Many people consider themselves very intellectual and rational. For them, everything requires proof. They say that there is no scientific proof of the existence of the soul, that it is not something substantial, or that if it exists at all, it is simply a byproduct of the processes going on in the physical brain. It does not exist independent of the body and the brain. It merely comes into being. It does not precede being. There is no soul. Where, they insist, is the proof of its existence? To these people, I say, how can you doubt the existence of this doubter, the one who is doing the doubting? Eyes and ears do not doubt. What is doing this? You cannot doubt the existence of your own consciousness. No proof is required. Its existence does not depend on logic and science. It is existential. You cannot say, I don't know whether I exist or don't exist. This is absurd. How can you say, I don't believe that I exist? There is no way to deny that you, the soul, pure consciousness without body, without senses and the mind, exist. Everything else can be doubted. One of the greatest Western philosophers, Descartes, used doubt as a method to reach this same conclusion. He started his search for truth with doubt, very penetrating doubt. He was the consummate philosopher. He understood that unless there is a known basic fact which cannot be doubted, he could not construct a philosophical system. There would be no foundation to build upon. If everything could be doubted or had to be proved with tricks, with words, then the whole thing would be just logic. It would have no practical or actual significance. Something deep down must be indubitable, which does not need any proof. Descartes, starting from this point, goes on examining one thing after another until, ultimately, he comes to the soul, to his own indubitable existence. The self, the soul, is indubitable because it is self-evident. No proof is needed, no argument and no logic is required. It is self-evident. Descartes realized, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist. I am conscious, therefore I exist. I have said so much because in the West we find very few people who will acknowledge the existence of the human soul. Even when they do acknowledge its existence, there are even fewer who make a distinction between the soul and the mind. The mind is abstract, thinking is abstract. The mind, without the aid of the soul, cannot experience reality. It cannot touch, it cannot see, it cannot hear, or have any experience independent of the consciousness it derives from the human soul. It cannot experience reality. It can only think, and through thinking, contemplate upon the experiences being picked up by the human soul. It is an epiphenomenon. The point which must be understood in order to enjoy the distinction between the mind and the soul is that the mind does not possess its own consciousness. It is not as if there are two beings within us, one mental and the other non-mental. There is only one conscious being. Consciousness is being derived only from the human soul. The mind has no consciousness of its own. It is simply a device used by the soul in order to have a certain species of conscious experience. The mind and the mental processes it performs is being sustained by consciousness arising from the human soul. But because consciousness is constantly flowing through the mind, we get identified with it. We feel that we, as conscious beings, are the mind. This false identification with the mind is called ego. It is this ego which gives rise to our assumption that the mind is the source of human consciousness, and, therefore, is the same thing as the soul, when, in fact, the difference between them is so immense, in terms of the quality of experience arising from each, that there is not even an overlap between the two. The human mind, as stated earlier, functions only in time, space, and causation, whereas the soul functions only outside of time, space, and causation. There is nothing common between the two. The soul of every human being has the capacity to have conscious experiences which do not suffer from the limitations of time, space, and causality. This must be clearly understood. Soul is the capacity in human consciousness to use intuition. Suddenly, a flash of knowledge comes to us. We just know something. When did we seek it? When did this knowing happen? Where? How? These questions have no answers, because there is no time, space, or causality accompanying the function of the intuitive process in human consciousness. Very often, this sudden flash of knowledge is rejected by us, because it is sometimes quite inconsistent with what the mind has been thinking. The reasoning process says that we should do this or that, and suddenly an intuitive flash comes, which is very often inconsistent with logic, and inconsistent with the conclusion reached through the mind. Yet this non-mental knowing is always right. Intuition has never been wrong. The human soul, the capacity in consciousness to experience knowledge which lies beyond time, space, and causation, also gives man the capacity to have another type of intuitive experience, the experience of love, the capacity of complete identification with another human being. Whenever you experience love for somebody, it is a sudden, timeless, causeless, and spaceless experience. This great experience of love, which makes us lose our own identity and transfers all our attention to the beloved, does not occur in time or space, nor does it follow the laws of causality. It does not result from any of the mental processes of the mind. One minute it is not there, and the next, it has totally consumed us. Afterwards, the mind can think about it, but this thinking and contemplation becomes a part of the mental process. Therefore, this thinking about love will take place in time, space, and causality. It very often happens that the mind, by thinking so much about what is happening during this experience of love, destroys the experience altogether. When you fall in love, the mind says, "Why have you fallen in love with this person?" You try to find some reason for it. Perhaps because she is beautiful. Maybe it's her personality which attracts you, and so on. However, this is not the case. These things are beautiful because you have fallen in love. This is what you do not understand. That is why you are so perplexed about other people's love. You think the person is crazy, that he has gone mad. How could he or she love this kind of a person? It does not make sense. Love never makes sense, because love does not come from the mind and its mental process. It is not a logical phenomenon. That is why we call it falling. You fall from the pinnacle of reasoning. You fall in love. You lose your sense of reason. You go mad. Love is a sort of madness, because it is not logical at all. The experience of love is of such a nature that it cannot be explained. But without love, man is simply a corpse. Minus love, life is nothing but misery. Plus love, life is bliss. Minus love, you are an empty void, a black hole. Minus love, you are only pretending to be alive, but you cannot really live. How can there be life minus love? Love is life. With the experience of love, your life starts soaring for the first time. You have wings. Minus love, you are just crawling on a tiny speck of mud, floating aimlessly amidst the appalling immensity of the physical universe. The significance of human existence is justifiable only if love is being experienced. The human soul, the capacity in human consciousness to experience love, as well as higher knowledge, also enables man to have another type of intuitive experience: beauty, the experience of aesthetics. Whenever we experience the beauty of a thing, the experience is identical with the experience of love and intuition. It does not subject itself to any of the laws of causality, time, and space. When you look at a beautiful landscape or a beautiful painting, you experience the beauty of these things intuitively. If you analyze the whole landscape, part by part, you will not be able to find any beauty. The beauty is coming from the totality of the experience. It is a synthesis of all the parts of its composition. And this experience of the oneness is called beauty, and is being experienced by the soul of man. When you have the experience of beauty, it comes in a sudden flash of intuition. It is experienced when the mind has become completely silent, when you are not aware of the stream of thoughts flowing in it, when verbalization ceases, when the intellect has shut down, when you are in a state of no-mindness. This is when beauty is experienced. When the mind returns, when intellect again takes possession of you, when you contemplate on what you are experiencing, the experience of beauty is lost. These experiences of beauty, love, and intuitive knowledge do not arise from any of the mental processes of the human mind whatsoever. They are arising from the fourth level of higher awareness, from the soul of man. It is an awareness which arises from a much deeper part of the human consciousness, which is beyond the scope of the intellect and the mind. And yet we do not regard intuition as a different function in human consciousness from that of the mind. We go on thinking that whenever the mind, working very fast, is able to execute the steps of logic rapidly, it is intuition. However, this is not the case. Intuition is something that arises in consciousness separately from the mind. The mind is incapable of the pure intuitive process. There are certain psychic phenomena that are called intuitive, but are actually this other kind of mental intuition. This is not the kind of intuition of which I have been speaking. Some people can think very quickly, can go through the successive stages of logic very fast, but they are still functioning in time. Suddenly, a thought comes to them, and they spend a few seconds thinking about it. Then they are able to come up with an answer. Most so-called psychic people who are able to do these things are merely capable of thinking very fast, and so are capable of mental intuition. They are capable of reaching certain conclusions very quickly, which would otherwise take a much longer time to be reached via the process of reasoning. Now, this particular capacity of fast-paced thinking, of coming up with a quick answer, is not pure intuition. Their answer could be wrong or right, because they are still using the mind. On the other hand, the pure intuitive flash of knowledge requires no time, not even a few seconds, and its answers are never wrong. The distinction between the two could be in terms of accuracy and time. In the pure intuitive process, no errors are ever made, and no time is taken to know the answer. Therefore, this is a very basic difference between the intuition which is based on the use of the mind and that which arises from the soul of man. The intuition of which I am speaking is the capacity of human consciousness to function without the use of the mind. Now, the only question which remains is whether we can use this capacity of consciousness willfully. Is it possible that we can use the mind up to a point and then switch over to use intuition? Is there any particular technique or training available which can enable us to learn how to use the intuitive process? If there is, then we could avoid the numerous problems which result from the exclusive use of the mind. The reply that has been given by these Eastern philosophers and mystics is, yes. All this can be done. They have said that there can be systematically arranged programs to educate man in the use of intuition, just as there are schools which are designed to develop man's skills of reasoning and use of logic. All of our schools and educational programs are arranged to build up the individual's power of analysis, the power and capacity to break and divide things into parts. Reasoning and logic then proceed upon these parts in order to reach a conclusion about the whole. Our entire educational system and all the processes and techniques of teaching rely upon the use of analytical faculty, the intellect. The result is that whenever anyone comes out of a university, he has simply become a machine, a computer. It is as if he has no soul, only intellect. And then he creates problems wherever he goes. He will create them because the university has given him only intellect and ego, and nothing else. He has neither learned a single bit of humanity nor one bit of humility. He has not touched a single bit of his soul. He has been stuffed with intellect, and this intellect gives him the feeling that he is very significant and important. Because he has a lot of so-called knowledge, he becomes identified with the intellect, with the mind. The ego is strengthened, and now he creates every kind of problem that is humanly possible. He will separate and divide life into politics, economics, and so on, which in turn breed jealousy, ambition, violence, cutthroat competition, and constant struggle. We have intellectualized life. We have cut it up into bits and pieces, broken it into parts, and are now wondering where the beauty of life has gone. The method of the intellect is to separate and divide. There is no other way in which the intellect can function, except by breaking things apart, euphemistically referred to as analysis, whereas the soul of man functions not by breaking experience apart, but by joining things together by synthesis, by love. By synthesis, we experience the beauty of the whole. When we experience life in its totality, the beauty of life reappears. The intuition, this much greater capacity for experience, which lies hidden in every human being, is being destroyed by an excessive use of the intellect. We have not done anything to develop this higher faculty available in human consciousness. We must use this faculty of intuition, of synthesis, which enables man to experience things as a whole, to experience things totally. We have been trained to see only bits and pieces of a thing, and yet what our inner consciousness really wants to have is the total view, the total knowledge of things. Only the intuitive faculty in human consciousness can provide this. The intuitive process draws upon the totality of experience which has taken place in consciousness throughout its entire history, and throws up into our awareness the answer. Reasoning, on the other hand, picks up only a tiny part of our experience, applies logic, and then reaches its conclusion. It is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. All logic, whether inductive or deductive, proceeds upon a given premise. A premise is merely a part of the experience, which becomes the subject of our thoughts and the reasoning process. When we apply deductive logic to a premise, we gain no new knowledge. When we apply inductive logic, we can never be certain about the conclusion. In either case, the situation remains the same, unchanged. Very often, the data that we proceed upon is itself inadequate. Sometimes we reason out exactly what we would do in a particular situation, and then later we find out that what we decided on was wrong. Not because the logic itself was wrong, but because we didn't know at the time of our decision the other additional data which was relevant to the situation. The absence of adequate data leads to wrong results, and this happens whenever we use the process of reasoning to make our decisions. This is one of the biggest flaws and weaknesses of reasoning. It must rely, in most cases, on inadequate data, thereby making it incapable of supplying accurate and total knowledge. The process of reasoning proceeds from a given premise, a part of experience which is always limited. On the other hand, this limitation of data does not occur in the use of intuition. With the intuitive process, there is no deliberate choosing of a particular set of data or premise. Intuition draws upon the total conscious experience of the human being, the unconscious experience of the past, as well as that which lies within the immediate awareness of the individual. The intuitive process is based upon the entire scope of the individual's experience and knowledge, not only of oneself, of one's personal past, but that of the whole history of mankind as well. This may seem hard to believe for those who are hearing it for the first time, but this total knowledge of experience is in fact being transferred from person to person through the genetic principle. This huge storehouse of knowledge, containing the unconscious memories of the entire experience of human evolution, is accessible through the use of the intuitive process. Intuition is based on this knowledge of the totality of the human experience. By having access to the entire history of human experience, it is easy for intuition, the soul of man, to arrive at the smallest details of a given situation and determine with absolute precision everything connected with it. When man uses the intuitive process in human consciousness, it is not confined only to the knowledge picked up from the selected data. Therefore, when intuition has been developed and is properly functioning, it can never go wrong. This is the experience of all those who have trained their intuition. They have found that a properly trained intuition never goes wrong, whereas even the best and most highly trained intellect very often reaches wrong conclusions, not because of any flaw in logic or in the reasoning process, but simply because of the inadequacy of the data being used. However, this does not suggest that there can be no deficiency in the reasoning process itself. A well-known professor of philosophy at Harvard University, Professor Charles Sanders Peirce, has written several very interesting books in which he examines the deficiency inherent in the logic used in the reasoning process. In one of his books, he has dismissed the use of certain types of logic because they are entirely useless when applied to the non-mathematical world. He points out that certain syllogisms, like A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C, and so on, are never practical in the real world. In this world, it is never the case that any A equals B. Therefore, To talk in terms of a theoretical model, which has no practical application, clearly means that this kind of logic is of no use in this world. The real world of people consists of an entirely different kind of relationship. If A loves B, and B loves C, in the real world we find that it does not logically and necessarily follow that A loves C. A may or may not love C. When we use logic of this kind to solve problems in the world of mathematics and physics, there is no possibility of going wrong, because these relationships will follow the rules of logic. But when this same logic is applied to man, to a conscious living being, there is every possibility of going wrong. Life does not follow the rules of logic. Life has its own hidden laws, and you cannot reduce them to any kind of formula or equation. Therefore, ordinary logic, when applied to people and to real situations in life, fails. Syllogisms have no practical value when we consider real situations and circumstances of life. A new set of rules must be introduced. Ordinary logic, which insists that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, is unrealistic and cannot be applied to the relationships which exist between human beings. It is completely useless in all matters pertaining to practical life, especially in our personal relationships. Interestingly enough, this Harvard philosopher goes on to formulate an alternative set of equations designed to meet our human needs. However, the point I simply want to make is that we have been overemphasizing the use of logic and reasoning, to the extent that we have shut out our capacity to use our intuition, the other faculty of knowing which exists in human consciousness. This faculty of ours has been completely ignored, and we must look at the methods of developing the intuition and the use of the intuitive process reliably, not accidentally, and at will.